Hello everyone and welcome back again to Whiskey Wednesday. I promise you something weird, I've got you something weird, and it's actually something I bought quite a long time ago, retrospectively. This rather tall, unusual looking thing is from Glenmore Spirits, but it's bottled as Rare Find. It's got this beautiful little fingerprint. Does it still? Oh yeah, the fingerprint's kind of on the Rare Find bit. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. Oh, there it is, you see that there. Part of Glenmore Spirits. They are a relatively new independent bottler. I think they started in 2015 or 2016, but I'm going to say 2015. The company I work for, the Whisky Shop, had a couple of exclusives. There was a Glenmorangie 35-year-old, which was called Tranquility, which was like 350 quid. It was kind of a bargain for what it was. We had an Altavania 22-year-old, which was really fun. And a Bowmore, oh no wait, a Glenfarclas 39-year-old, that was about £200. And a Bowmore, which I think never saw the light of day because I think one customer tried to buy all of it. So I don't know if we actually got that or not. But this is something that I purchased when I was in holiday in Greece last year. I was scrolling through, it was either Royal Mile whiskies or Tindrum whiskies, and I was like, ooh, that sounds interesting. So, for all of you watching, I've actually not said what it is yet. This is a 15-year-old single cask whiskey from Dailuaine, and it's matured most of its life in a bourbon barrel. Unfortunately, it doesn't say it on the label, but I remember purchasing it because of this fact. It is then finished in a white wine barrel. Now that is quite a colour for a white wine cask, but the white wine cask is a finish, and I don't actually know how long for because there's not a lot of information about what kind of wine the cask was in the barrel, I should say, and how long this actually sat in bourbon before it was transferred into said wine barrel. But it's a 15-year-old at 55.3%, natural colour, non-chill filtered, distilled 2007, bottled in 2023. I purchased this October or late September last year, had it delivered and cracked it open when it first arrived. Now, as you can see, I've had this for a year and not gone through quite a lot of it. It's probably nearly at half a bottle, and I'll be honest, about that much of that has been in the last couple of weeks, just because I wanted to get a hang of it a little bit more. For those of you that have never heard of Dailuaine, a bit of a personal story, then some facts and figures. Dailuaine was essentially the first ever independently bottled whiskey I ever tried that made me understand what independent bottling was really about. I was quite new into my whiskey retail days, getting a hang of production methods, style, regional differences, different types of peat, etc, etc. And I was handed a glass of a 12-year-old Douglas of Drumlamrig Dailuaine 12, which I ended up buying probably about 4 or 5 bottles of over time. And it was the most caramelly, rich, sweet sherry cask. At 46%, about 700 bottles produced. And I did a review on it years and years ago. I think it's the same week I reviewed like Nika Coffee Grain, if you go back into the archives. And the last bottle of it I cherished, and eventually I opened it and drank it all, I think during COVID, and just loved it, and it was a nice like sign off to that. But what makes Dailuaine different? Not much these days, I will say, but back in the day, I think in the 70s and into the 80s, they had a very strange use of condensers in the sense that they were copper condensers, which is something you don't see much of anymore. That gave the spirit a particularly powerful, robust style. I believe they replaced those in either the 80s or the 90s. And now it is one of the Diageo Johnny Walker single malt distilleries, so most of it goes into Johnny Walker. You rarely see it as a standard single malt outside of, there's been an official 16-year-old, part of the Flora and Fauna range. A couple of years ago, well, nearly a decade ago, there was a Diageo special release 34-year-old, which smelled delicious, but didn't taste great. And this, along with Mortlach, Dailuaine, it's always been called like a more robust, meatier style of Speyside, which I always thought could compete with things like Macallan, because people think Macallan is this, you know, sweet, light whiskey. Realistically, Macallan has got some like base to it. Not necessarily the newer distillates that we'll be seeing in the next couple of years, but the older distillates of Macallan, they've always had that slight sulphury hint. They've always had like good weight to them, and Dailuaine's always had that for me. But here we have it in this glass. and white wine cask maturation, or even finishing, but type of maturation. Not common. I've always said with my work colleagues, one work colleague in particular has always said he would love to try like Bal Blair, matured in bourbon and finished in some sort of white wine barrel. Not seen that yet. Someone might have that sat somewhere. But here we have it. So let's have a little smell. Ooh, sorry, it's a little bit prickly on the nose. Ah, the nose is just like Cadbury's Fruit and Nut, which is quite incredible given that it has been in bourbon prior. You don't typically get those fruit and nut profiles from bourbon. It's more of a sherry thing, typically, but there's always an exception. The fruit and nut, the chocolate, there's a real fudgy note to it as well. You don't really pick out any wine, but as it's a finish and a relatively old whiskey at high strength, you probably wouldn't anyway. But if you gave it to me blind, there was no way I would tell you this was a Dailuaine. I'm not sure where my brain would go. Fudgy styles of whiskey, chocolatey styles of whiskey would make me go Glenfarclas, or perhaps some sort of, you know, Tobermory releases, Deanston, very fudgy, chocolatey style of whiskey. But it's such an alluring nose, it just pulls you in. And I think having this open for such a long time, I think I remember the first glass being just particularly over the top and a little bit spicy. But having this open now for nearly a year, it just allows it to maybe mellow out a little bit. Let's taste it, we'll see what's going on. Some very interesting things occurring on the palate. I'm glad I tried this a couple of nights ago because it's being very consistent and the finish is pretty outrageous. So the initial taste, we have almost a replica of the nose. You've got this chocolate, fudge, nutty, pecan, maple. I mean, it's just turned the 1st of September today. It's about 20 degrees outside and I'm sweating in this hoodie, but it fits this autumnal flavour profile. As you chew on all that sweetness, there's a development of spice and there is a development of dryness, and it just keeps on going and going and going. Only as I'm talking to you now, as all of that dryness began to cease and I'm beginning to get a little bit of moisture back into my mouth. The nutty thing begins to really run away with it. It really starts to grab hold of the reins and take control. Outside of the white wine finish, single cask whiskey at 15 years old at cask strength, you should always expect a little bit of dryness, a little bit of spiciness. It'd be silly not to. But one thing that has me intrigued is that even with that, I still can't really taste any wine. I've tried this thing with a little bit of water, a lot of water, and it never really pops that wine note. So I'm trying to think, either it added more of that chocolatey fudge thing, or it's helping with the developing of the dryness. Unfortunately, I just wish that it said on the bottle that it was finished in what type of wine, but annoyingly it doesn't. I was convinced it did, but sadly not. But this one, it's a little bit of a passion project. So this bottle wasn't cheap. I think I paid like, it's like 80 something pounds. So it's not a cheap bottle of whiskey. And the bottles I've had from Rare Find in my work life, I really enjoyed. I'm not a Glenfarclas fan, but that 29-year-old, was it a 29 or a 39? God knows, can't remember. It was an old Glenfarclas. And I remember thinking, that's delicious. It's what I've always wanted Glenfarclas to taste like. The Alta Vanya was really lemony and sweet. It was just like a perfectly crisp summertime whiskey. And the Glenmorangie 35 I regret not buying. Because old Glenmorangie is delicious, and a 35-year-old Glenmorangie for about 300 and something pounds is kind of a good deal. It was just white chocolate and pineapple. It was just delicious. So I bought this on the hunch of, you know, those styles being really good, and this is a very good whiskey, but I do find it quite challenging. It is a very dry whiskey, it is a very spicy whiskey. But I think it's one of those things where, as whiskey fans, if you buy a single cask product and you take a little bit of a gamble on it, if you have the expendable income to do so, it's always worth experiencing it with preferably your preferred type of distilleries. But it took me a while to really like this whiskey, and I think that's quite an important story, because not everything you will like you will enjoy. Some things will be a challenge. But the more I've drank it recently, the more I'm beginning to enjoy it more and just indulge in its profile, rather than me trying to look for these wine cask notes, which is something I've wanted to try for a very long time. A single malt whiskey finished in white wine, or any type of whiskey finished in white wine. Red wine's readily available, but yeah, the white wine thing just got me. But it's a very nice product. It's not the most complex thing in the world. It's got a beautifully indulgent nose. It becomes really spicy and really drying and really over the top. So if you can find any of this and you're into things like Cavalan Vino Barrique, perhaps some of the older like cash strength, when I say older I mean releases from a long time ago like Abel-Arabunas, and if you're into older like Glenfarclas releases and things, this could be something for you, in all honesty. I am going to enjoy drinking it, and it is going to be something particularly tasty, but it's not the whiskey I automatically reach for. As a result, I'm only going to score it a 7.5. It is fun, it is interesting, it is a distillery that I naturally love, but it is something that is quite a challenge, and something that I feel I need to experiment and do more with to perhaps find these notes that I'm looking for. If they don't turn up, that's fine. It will be a fun adventure. But if you have a bottle like this of your own at home, you know, try not to generate any sort of hatred for it, because it can be quite easy to do. Just nourish it, take it slow, and see if it begins to open up and reveal itself a little bit more. But yes, thank you all for watching. I will see you next week for something, again, pretty intense. But that is the Dailuaine 15-year-old rare find. It's a 7.5 out of 10, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.